You wake to the sound of something moving in the darkness. Not close enough to attack yet, but close enough that you know. Your eyes snap open. Your body tenses. There's no gradual transition from sleep to alertness. In this world, that pause costs you your life. Around you, others in your group are stirring, and you know without discussion what happens next. Everyone moves to the center of the clearing. The fire is already dying, it's been dead for hours. Actually, because maintaining controlled flame requires technology you don't possess yet. The glow you see around the rocks is just residual heat that you've been sitting near all night, taking turns being the unlucky one on the perimeter. The sound comes again. Closer. It could be a leopard. It could be a hyena pack. It could be wild dogs. The distinction barely matters. All of them hunt things your size. All of them would kill you if given the chance. You grip the rock you sleep next to, not sharp enough to be a weapon in the modern sense, but heavy enough that if something gets within arm's reach, you can make it regret the decision. The night drags on. By the time dawn arrives, you're exhausted. You haven't slept more than 2 hours. Your group hasn't eaten in 2 days. And you have to leave this clearing to find food, which means walking out into the territory of the same predators you've been defending against all night. This is not a crisis moment. This is Tuesday. 2 million years ago. Your species is barely a species at all in the modern sense. You're Homo erectus, or something close to it. Your brain is larger than your ancestors, but it's still half the size of a modern human brain. You have language, maybe. Probably not the kind that lets you tell complex stories or discuss abstract concepts. More likely grunts and calls that convey immediate information. You have tools, but they're simple. Rocks banged together to create sharp edges. Good enough for cutting into carcasses. Not much else. You have social groups, but they're small. Maybe 15 to 30 individuals, fluctuating based on the constant reality that people die regularly. You don't farm. You don't have permanent settlements. You don't have gods or philosophy or art, or at least not the kind that leaves clear archaeological evidence. What you have is an overwhelming, every waking moment focus on not dying in the next few hours. And by some miracle, most of the time, you don't. But the margin between success and failure is thinner than you'd think possible. Understanding what life was actually like in this period requires abandoning almost every assumption you have about human existence. We tend to imagine our ancestors as either noble savages living in harmony with nature, or desperate hunter-gatherers barely scraping by. Both frameworks are wrong. The reality is more fundamental and more depressing. Early humans existed in a state of constant, low-level crisis that they processed not as crisis but as normal. The baseline state of existence involved regular injuries, chronic malnutrition, constant threat from larger predators, and the knowledge that most of your children wouldn't reach adulthood. Yet your species persisted, not through any special wisdom or virtue, but through a psychology that had adapted to accept the unacceptable as simply the way things were. Learning how your predecessors coped with this existence reveals something crucial about human nature that we've tried very hard to forget in the comfortable present. Start with the basics. Food. You're spending somewhere between 4 and 6 hours per day engaged in direct food acquisition. You're not farming. You're not managing herds. You're searching. You're looking for carcasses left by larger predators, taking the scraps that those predators have abandoned. You're hunting smaller animals with primitive weapons. You're gathering plants, though no one is quite sure yet how much of your diet consists of vegetation versus meat. The uncertainty itself is telling. Early human diets were probably opportunistic to an almost chaotic degree. If you found a dead zebra, you ate it. If you found a patch of figs, you ate them. If you killed a rabbit, you consumed it. The emphasis wasn't on finding optimal nutrition. It was on finding anything nutritious before someone else did. Malnutrition is chronic. Your bones show signs of stress. Growth lines on your teeth indicate periods where you didn't eat enough during development. If you're female and you survive to adulthood, you're probably never more than a few months away from starvation risk. If you're male, it's slightly better, but only because males have greater muscle mass and can sometimes be sacrificed in lean times. The predator situation is the piece we tend to understate. Modern humans think of lions and leopards as rare, dangerous, but essentially background to existence. For early humans, large predators were co-equal predators. You occupied the same ecological niche. You ate the same prey. You competed for the same scavenging opportunities. And in direct combat, the predators had almost every advantage. A leopard has claws, teeth, and reflexes you don't possess. A lion is significantly larger and stronger. A hyena pack is coordinated and persistent. Your advantages were tool use and thrown missiles. Except your thrown missiles were really just rocks, and your accuracy was probably not great. The fossil record from this period is grim. You find skulls with puncture wounds from leopard teeth. You find skeletons missing limbs, suggesting the individual was killed and dismembered by a large predator. You find evidence of healed fractures that would have been debilitating in an environment where physical capacity directly correlates with survival probability. Many of these individuals survived the initial injury only to die later from infection or starvation because they couldn't effectively forage. Some of the healed injuries suggest that other individuals cared for the injured person while they were incapacitated, which is interesting. But it's also a significant resource drain on a group living on the edge of starvation. The sleeping situation alone would be a catastrophe by modern standards. You don't have tents. You don't have structures in the modern sense. You have clearings where you gather at night, sometimes near rock outcrops that provide marginal protection. Your entire defense against predation during the hours you're unconscious depends on the idea that there's safety in numbers. A predator is less likely to attack a group than an individual. Probably, but there's no certainty. Archaeological evidence suggests that groups often occupied sites specifically chosen for their defensibility, places where you could see threats coming, places where predators had limited approach vectors. But even in the best locations, night is inherently dangerous. You sleep in shifts, or you sleep lightly, never fully unconscious. You sleep surrounded by others, which provides both protection and disease transmission. If one person in your group has a respiratory infection, everyone has it by morning. If someone has parasites, they're distributing them throughout the group. Your microbiome is a nightmare landscape of pathogens that your immune system has learned to tolerate rather than eliminate. You're never fully healthy. You're just at different levels of unhealthy. The social dynamics of such a small group would probably feel suffocating to a modern human, but they're necessary for survival. Everyone's business is everyone else's business because individual decisions affect group survival. If someone's injured, it affects group mobility. If someone's sick, It affects everyone's health. If someone wants to leave, it reduces the group's numbers and defensive capacity. The social pressure to conform is immense and informal. There's probably a hierarchy. Certain individuals have more status or decision-making power, but it's not institutionalized the way modern hierarchies are. The leadership depends on continued consensus. Lead badly and your followers can simply leave, which is why early group structures probably alternated between cooperation and coalition building based on immediate circumstances. Violence within groups is a constant possibility, kept in check by the knowledge that group fragmentation leaves everyone more vulnerable to predators. The psychological toll of this constant negotiation, this permanent tension between individual autonomy and group necessity, is difficult to overestimate. Gender dynamics in this period are speculative but probably involved, kind of enforced interdependence. Males were probably larger and stronger on average, giving them an advantage in hunting and physical combat. Females bore children at significant physical cost, with high maternal mortality rates. Children required years of parental investment before becoming productive. The evidence suggests that both sexes contributed significantly to food acquisition, but that their contributions had different risk profiles. Males engaged in more dangerous hunting and scavenging, experiencing higher injury and death rates. Females engaged in gathering and perhaps in hunting smaller game, with lower injury rates but higher absolute mortality from reproductive complications. The sexual division of labor existed not as ideology but as practical necessity, though the ideology would have developed around it to justify what was actually just survival math. But here's where conventional narratives about primitive life start to break down. Among the evidence from sites occupied by Homo erectus and early Homo sapiens, you find objects that have no clear utilitarian function. Shells with holes drilled through them, pigmented rocks, ornaments, not food, not shelter, not weapons. These objects required time and effort to create or collect, time that could have been spent foraging or sleeping. They appear at multiple sites across different populations. The most parsimonious explanation is that early humans valued aesthetics, that they cared about objects beyond their practical function, that they engaged in behavior that served psychological or social purposes rather than direct survival. This is disturbing to materialist explanations because it suggests that even in conditions of genuine scarcity and constant threat, humans invested resources in meaning-making. You were suffering, malnourished, constantly afraid, and yet you still spent time creating ornamentation. The question of why is one that we still haven't adequately answered. One possibility is that ornamentation served social signaling functions. An object worn by an individual could communicate status, group membership, kinship relationships, or reproductive availability. In a world where language is limited, visual signals become more important. Another possibility is that creating or possessing objects served psychological functions. You're living in a state of constant threat and deprivation. Your brain needs anchor points, things that are meaningful beyond mere survival. Creating an ornament, decorating yourself, possessing something beautiful, these might have been ways of maintaining psychological coherence in an environment designed to fragment it. The archaeological evidence suggests that humans in this period experienced something we might call depression or existential despair at rates that probably rivaled modern populations. The skull fractures and healed injuries show evidence of violence, but so do the patterns of mortality. Many individuals died young from infections, from malnutrition, from predation. Yet populations persisted. They reproduced. They created objects without obvious function. They maintained group cohesion despite circumstances that should have created constant internal conflict. But it's crucial to resist the temptation to romanticize this existence through modern frameworks. Early human life wasn't noble or pure. It was brutal and short and filled with suffering. The average life expectancy was probably somewhere between 25 and 35 years, assuming you survived childhood, which roughly half of you didn't. The prevalence of degenerative joint disease, of chronic infections, of untreated injuries that became permanent disabilities, these aren't poetic elements of a simpler time. They're evidence of constant physical suffering. The absence of modern medicine, modern nutrition, modern sanitation meant that ailments that we treat as minor could be catastrophic. A infected cut becomes gangrenous, becomes death. A parasite becomes chronic malnutrition, becomes vulnerability to every other infection. A fracture becomes permanent mobility loss, becomes inability to compete for resources, becomes starvation. The cognitive burden of maintaining social cohesion, while constantly aware that most children born in your group won't survive to adulthood, that's a weight that modern humans have largely avoided through institutional solutions and denial. Your ancestors carried it consciously. The counterargument, worth seriously considering, is that we're imposing modern assumptions about quality of life onto a period where those assumptions don't apply. An early human didn't experience their existence as the constant crisis that our narrative describes because they had no alternative framework to compare it to. Pain tolerance was probably higher. Infant and child mortality was normalized in a way that the modern mind finds almost incomprehensible. The concept of suffering as something that requires amelioration might not have existed in the form we experience it. From this perspective, early human life might have been no more subjectively unpleasant than modern life. Just unpleasant in different ways. You didn't have social anxiety or depression in the modern sense. You had predators and hunger. The suffering was different in character, if not degree. There's also the question of whether we're reading the archaeological evidence correctly. We find healed fractures and assume violence. We find parasites and assume disease. We find low population densities and assume starvation. But these interpretations assume that early humans existed in marginal conditions at all times. It's possible that some populations, in some periods, occupied environments where resources were relatively abundant. Coastal populations might have had access to reliable marine resources. Populations in riverine valleys might have had access to seasonal abundance that buffered against scarcity. The archaeological record is episodic. We see snapshots of certain sites at certain times, not continuous occupation or complete population data. We're inferring pattern from fragments, yet the aggregated evidence from multiple sites, multiple populations, across hundreds of thousands of years, points toward a consistent picture. Early human existence involved high mortality rates, periodic resource scarcity, constant predation pressure, and limited technology for addressing any of these problems. The populations that persisted were those that developed psychological and social mechanisms for coping with these constraints. They developed small group cohesion through face-to-face interaction and enforced mutual obligation. They developed the capacity to accept deprivation as normal. They developed meaning-making systems, possibly art, certainly ritual and ornamentation that provided psychological anchor points beyond mere survival. They developed a kind of stoicism, not through philosophy but through necessity. You accepted suffering because the alternative was fragmenting into despair. The real insight isn't that life was terrible, though it probably was by modern standards. The insight is that humans demonstrated an extraordinary capacity to adapt psychologically to circumstances that would be considered catastrophic in the modern world. Early humans didn't just survive starvation and predation and constant threat. They maintained complex social relationships, created meaningful objects, and presumably experienced joy and connection alongside the deprivation. The brain that organized all this, that maintained social bonds, that created meaning, that persisted in the face of constant threat, that brain was already recognizably human. It was smaller than ours, but it was solving fundamentally human problems. How to live together despite scarcity, how to create meaning despite suffering, how to maintain hope despite constant threat of death. What's worth sitting with is how that brain might have worked. Most of your cognitive energy went toward immediate problems. Finding food, avoiding predators, maintaining group relationships. There probably wasn't much spare capacity for abstract thought or long-term planning beyond the seasonal level. But the objects we find suggest that some capacity for meaning-making persisted even under these constraints. You weren't just surviving. You were creating things that had no survival value, which means you were allocating resources to experience beauty or significance even when you were malnourished. That's not primitive. That's distinctly human. It suggests that the gap between your ancestors and you is smaller than you'd like to believe. That the capacity for meaning-making and aesthetic experience isn't dependent on material abundance, but emerged in spite of its absence. The question worth considering is what that says about your own relationship to meaning when you live in the opposite state, material abundance, without clear purpose. Your ancestors found significance in a shell with a hole in it, made meaning from a rock decorated with pigment, created social bonds that had no economic value. They did this while starving. You have access to unlimited information, unlimited material goods, unlimited connection, and yet struggle to find meaning. Perhaps the lesson isn't about your ancestors' resilience in the face of deprivation. Perhaps it's about your own vulnerability in the face of abundance.